Oftentimes, when somebody does lose a life, what went on is held, up under the microscope. Some people might say they should have done this and they shouldn't have done that. Just because you survive a mountain doesn't make you an expert, and it doesn't. I don't think it gives you any right to say that somebody made a mistake. Because you just, when you weren't there, you don't know. Only the mountain knows.
Look, I know that it's weirdly springtime in January right now, but like, why do I have to read things that just make me feel cold? So let's talk about how I'm beyond late to the party and a total ignoramus. So through a really roundabout set of circumstances, I ended up watching the 2015 film Everest, which, like I'm assuming most people knew, was about the 1996 Mount Everest disaster. I didn't know what that was. I remember when that movie was coming out and I first saw a trailer for it, I went, oh, it's another schlocky Hollywood disaster film, and like, Jake Gyllenhaal and all those people are gonna live, but like they're gonna struggle to get there. Maybe some unnamed character that we barely know is gonna die, but like, it'll be fine. Because I didn't know what the 1996 Mount Everest disaster was. However, it being me, once I saw the whole based on true events and went, oh, this is not a schlocky Hollywood film about where everybody lives and it's great. Oh, this is a disaster where a whole bunch of people died and it was really sad. Oh. I didn't really know anything about Mount Everest. I know it's the highest mountain in the world, and I know that like there are idiots who go and climb it. They're not idiots. Some of them by this point are, but that's a whole different argument. We could get into the commercialization of Everest and how people who are not equipped are constantly going to Everest for selfies, and like, we're not getting into that argument. I really didn't know much about Everest, so I wasn't aware that the 1996 Everest disaster was a thing. And this is a disaster where in one night, basically 8 people died up near around the summit area. And these were 8 people from 3 different expeditions. So it being me, I fell down a Wikipedia hole. And part of that Wikipedia hole involved a character from the film, who's not a character, he's a real person, named John Krakauer. And here's where I started to feel really dumb. As we know, I worked in a Barnes & Noble for a while. And there would come, as we called it, school reading season, where you have to buy certain titles in like bulk orders because every kid and their mother and their school teacher is buying it. One book that was very prevalent was Into Thin Air by John Krakauer. I knew nothing about this book. I didn't even read the full cover where it said like a personal story of the Everest disaster. I was like, Into Thin Air. I'm like, oh, it's by the guy who did Into the Wild. Cool. It's one of those books I'll never read because it's all about like nature and the wilderness. And admittedly, I didn't know Krakauer's writing style, so I figured, it just won't interest me. Boy, did I feel dumb because in the movie Everest, it's like John Krakauer, and I'm like the Into the Wild guy? I'm like, that guy? That guy? The Into Thin Air guy? Yeah, that guy. He was a part of the 1996 Everest disaster. That's literally why he wrote Into Thin Air. So beyond feeling dumb, I continue my Wikipedia hole and discover that the kind of 2 major accounts that a lot of people go for, the big one being Into Thin Air. Technically there's 3 now. The other one was by a guy named Anatoly Bukrev, who was one of the guides from one of the 3 missions. And he, in fact, and this is depicted in the film, he had summited, made it to the top, and come back down to Camp 4 kind of before everybody, before this storm hit. And after the storm hit, he went out into the storm completely alone to rescue stranded climbers. Like, he went out there, was like, okay, you're telling me I can walk this direction and I'll find like 5 people? No problem. Well, I mean, problem, it was extremely difficult, and what he did was nowhere short of heroic. It was, I can't imagine just making the decision after having already summited Everest without supplemental oxygen to then go out into a hurricane force storm where they were saying the winds were anywhere from 40 to 80 miles per hour, that the already lowered oxygen, because at that height, your oxygen is at about like 1/3 what it is at sea level, which is why you climb with supplemental oxygen, because you risk going into hypoxia, which is where your brain is deprived of oxygen and you're just like killing brain cells. But during the storm, it apparently lowered the level of oxygen kind of in the atmosphere another 14%, which attributed to the disaster. Now, they didn't know this at the time. This was found out later. So Anatoly Bukrev does this. Apparently, and not even apparently, John Krakauer is not kind to him. in Into Thin Air. Like, yes, he calls him heroic for going to rescue climbers, but he has some pretty choice words for decisions that Bukrev made, such as climbing without supplemental oxygen. He basically just illustrates him as little more than a intransigent employee who was finally doing his job when he went out to rescue climbers. As you can imagine, Bukrev didn't take that too well. So he teamed up with another author or writer and wrote what's essentially almost like a rebuttal book, and it's called The Climb. And it is his experience of the Everest disaster, because he and Krakauer were on two completely different teams that were climbing the mountain at the same time, who did eventually team up, but they were climbing on two different teams and had two very different experiences. And so I said, I'm going to read both of these. I'm going to read both Into Thin Air and The Climb, because I think it's only right to read both. But I really wanted to talk about Into Thin Air and The Climb because, for me, it brings up an important point. Because I thought about that time I worked at Barnes & Noble, and you'd always see Into Thin Air, but nobody was reading The Climb, and I think it's important to read both. In this case, you're talking multiple perspectives on a disaster where, besides the fact you have a natural disaster, you have this storm that comes in and wreaks all the havoc, but at the same time there were human decisions that were made that could have had an effect. Not even could have, very likely did. Pretty much did have an effect. For the record, I'm not going to sit here and criticize anybody's choices because I'm not a mountain climber. I was not there in 1996. I was 5 years old, like definitely was not there in 1996. I can't speak to what anybody was doing that was or wasn't professional, was or wasn't the right decision, unless it's something that to me just seems so absurd a decision on like a logical level that I go, why the fuck did you do that? Between the two books, Into Thin Air and The Climb, Into Thin Air is better written. Don Krakauer is a writer. Of course it's better written. It is supremely emotional. This is a book that even Krakauer admits he was sort of writing for catharsis. He was trying to kind of work through a lot of his emotions that he had after that disaster, and I think even to this day he says climbing Everest was the biggest mistake he ever made. I mean, it was an incredibly traumatic experience. He suffers PTSD as a result of it. I cannot imagine going through that experience. And he also has a lot of guilt. It is its own form of survivor's guilt. And it is simply a very compelling story in its way. Sort of feels strange that a tragedy is compelling, but hey, we all care about the Titanic because it sank, so we care about this because 8 people died. And in this case, most of the people who died were on the expedition that Krakauer was a part of, which was an expedition being led by kind of well-known climber mountaineer Rob Hall, and it was called the Adventure Consultants. Rob Hall was one of the first people I think really started seeing the potential for a business of amateur expeditions, commercializing expeditions. So it's like, I'm taking a bunch of people who are not natural climbers the way that I am, and I'm going to lead you to Everest. You will pay $65,000 a pop to do this. But I guess if you have that much money to spend, go ahead. And Rob Hall was well known for being a really good climber. He was very meticulous, very well organized. His trips were designed to be extremely safe because he goes, it's not just that I'm getting you to the summit, it's that I'm getting you back down the mountain. Because that tends to be where problems start, is when you're coming back down from the summit. And Krakauer joined this expedition. He was writing a piece for Outside Magazine, and mainly on kind of the commercialization of Everest. And they ran into some problems as a result of that. They had, at one point, a whole bunch of different teams that were trying to summit on the same day. It's part of why Rob Hall teamed up with another expedition being led by a guy named Scott Fisher, and they were called Mountain Madness. This is with whom Anatoly Bukrev was a guide. And so their expeditions teamed up just because they said, the two of us are all trying to summit on the same day. If we team up and work together, there's less likely to be a problem. So Into Thin Air is an extremely emotional book. It is not an easy read. It's a good listen, I will give that, but it is not easy. It's not easy to listen to somebody essentially relive their own trauma as well as try to recount the trauma of others who managed to survive and what little they know as a result of radio contact and everything else that was going on. But so too is The Climb. From Anatoly Bukrev's perspective, and this is a hard one because he didn't write it. There's a lot of interviews with him and it's very much his perspective. But it was being written by somebody else. I will say the climb has a pretty serious bias, which is that it made it seem like Bukrev couldn't make a wrong decision. The author sort of implies this with the way he writes it, although Bukrev himself says he went through the woulda, coulda, shouldas, the what ifs. He thought he looks back and says, maybe I could have done that different. You know, a 20/20 hindsight. The Climb is an extremely emotional book because it's the story of a guy who, was doing his job, got faced with a disaster, did the best that he could to save as many people as he could, with what little energy he had, in a storm where you couldn't see shit. And also, in his mind, failed. There were two people who, in his mind, he failed to save. One being Scott Fisher, because he couldn't get to him. Scott Fisher was way, way, way up the mountain. There was no way he was going to get to him in time, and it seemed like Scott Fisher, they say now, he was very likely suffering from something called HACE, which is basically an embolism, and that he apparently really wasn't looking too good. But the other person that Bukrev feels extremely responsible for is a woman named Yasko. She was a part of the Adventure Consultants team, and she was huddled with the group of people that he started bringing back one by one in the storm. He had thought she was dead. And if she wasn't, she was going to be there in like a minute or two. And the hard part for him was that the film makes a point of saying that like 1 pound feels like 10 when you're up on the mountain in that low level of oxygen. Now imagine even less oxygen. And imagine hurricane force winds, little to no visibility. You've already summited and come back down. Like, you've already rescued 4 to 5 other people. You go to this one woman who can't stand up. She couldn't move. I mean, she was so far gone from lack of oxygen, the cold, and everything else. If the person could not get up and move, he really could not help them. And apparently, and people can check me on this, from what I understand, there is kind of the unspoken rule on the mountain that if going to help somebody else is going to put you in serious risk and will very likely harm or kill you, you leave that person and you continue. Like, just leave them and go. I could be wrong. That's what I heard. I can understand that perspective. And so for Bukrev, it was the case of like, I can't carry her. I can't bring her. And she did eventually die. Now, Bukrev, after the entire incident and after going to funerals for Scott Fisher and all sorts of things, went up and actually made a point to try and treat the bodies of Scott Fisher and Yaskunamba with respect. He buried them in like cairns, with the stones that you put up. He actually met Yaskunamba's husband, who had kind of created an expedition to go and bring back his wife's body. And these are both very sad tales, but you also get Bukrev countering Krakauer, defending his actions, saying, I was actually not being an intransigent employee. I was working under Scott's orders. He thought it was best that I, summit, because I was doing it without oxygen, because he'd done it before. He'd climbed multiple 8,000er peaks without supplemental oxygen. This was what he did. He says, and came back down, and waited at Camp 4 with, so that if somebody needed extra oxygen or whatever, he could run up and get them, because he's like, cool, no problem. And there's definitely the whole kind of back third is a lot of him just saying, what the hell, Krakauer? Here's why I think it's important to read both. Students in America are all reading Into Thin Air. I don't even think any of them are told about the climb. And I do think it's important to provide that other perspective, because there's a really important saying. There are 3 sides to every story. Your side, their side, and the truth. In this case, only the mountain, only Everest knows the truth. But you owe it to the people who survived and the people who didn't to read multiple accounts of what happened, to get a clearer overview of the tragedy.
Thanks for watching me ramble today. If you'd like to see more from me, go ahead and click that button with my face on it. It'll take you to my channel where I ramble about a whole lot of different things. Got some thoughts of your own? Go ahead and leave them down in the comments. And make sure that if you want to see more ramblings from me, you click that little subscribe button. That's it for me today, you guys, so until next time, cheers.